And in today's live stream, we're going to be talking about governing by reason. This is going to be instead of the usual idea of governing by feelings, which a lot of people on the left seem to love to do. And talk about, we have people in poverty and we need to do something about it. We need to be governing by reason and understanding what the actual role of government is and what the actual role of what it states the people in these positions are supposed to be doing, and understanding what their actual roles are to begin with. And that's what we're going to be discussing here, and why governing by reason is very, very important. Because if you're not governing with a clear mind and governing clearly on these decisions, you're not going to basically be able to do what's actually within the best interest of what is under what is constitutional. And the only result that's going to happen is you're going to be voting what ends up being theft of the people, and it's only going to be harming others in which you thought you were helping in the long run. And it's going to result in higher food prices, higher prices for medical care, and basically the actual cost of living being unaffordable for everybody. And what's going to happen is you're basically going to think with it, I'm going to have to essentially redo all of these things a few years down the road. And it doesn't matter on these people being on the left or the right, or what the actual issue is, being if it's war, being if it's war overseas, being if it's some type of domestic issue with it. We need to actually look and think within reason of what is constitutional on the rights of the individual for these actual decisions on what is rational. And if it's not a rational decision and you're just going on feelings, then you should not be in that position. If you cannot go on a rational decision, if you do not have the capabilities, you have no business being in that position to begin with, and you should basically resign your post. Such as with government. Government is incapable of the idea of charity, because they do not understand how best to handle giving people that are deserving of money. And charity should be best done by the individual and not by force. And this is something where you're having people do this based on feelings, not by actual rational thought. And what's the end result is you're stealing money from certain people and giving it to others, and they're not even thinking about it rationally. And that's all it is. It's theft of certain people, and giving to others. And really, that's all the result is. And when people need to look at it, that's where the whole system needs to be known as. And in a rational system, that's where you need to view that as. You need to view the actual outcome of how the system works. And when you eliminate that, it's not you're actually stealing money from those receivers. you're actually restoring money to those people who are getting their money stolen by the government. When we view the like, let's take the idea of the war on drugs. It doesn't matter what we're talking about, whichever thing with it, whatever drug we're talking about. We need to view these things rationally. With policies, with the war on drugs, number one is the war on drugs is not needed to be viewed, if they were going to do something about it, needed to be viewed in a constitutional manner, just as alcohol prohibition was. Now, alcohol prohibition was, even though that was considered a massive failure, that was at least done constitutionally. Now, the drug prohibition was not done constitutionally. Basically, it was nothing more. It was nothing more than a UN resolution that was signed, and they felt that that they could basically do it under a vague ruling under the Commerce Act. Well, there was nothing stating that, and this is under a period under the 1970s where the judicial department was basically giving deference to the executive, and they were basically being very, very loose with the way that they were viewing the actual laws, and they were basically being very, very pro-government and letting the government run roughshod over the people when it came to freedom. We saw the NSA come over this period. We saw Roe v. Wade come over this period, even though there was no legitimacy to these rulings. If you actually take the idea of the founding documents in the way that they're actually written, and they should have been immediately rejected. I mean, Roe v. Wade, we know that that the actual evidence sitting right in front of them was, we had Kermit Gosnell out in Philadelphia, and the actual evidence, he said he gave pro bono abortions, and it wasn't a big deal that a bunch of women got sick and nearly died, and this was actually what was on the table at the time. So when we're talking about making rational decisions, is you need to view the actual idea of the actual Constitution, bro. Whether at that time they did not know, they were not making distinct decisions on the separate DNA of the child at the time, but we know specifically that there would be a separate DNA of the child at all times. So the fact is we can actually determine that's a separate life. So even at that time, they could have stated that this is too risky to do, and it risks the and doing these activities essentially are a violation of life because of these standards. And they would have shut it down immediately, and stating that that illegal ones are basically would be criminal activity anyway, and they're rare as is. So, and that would be based on a rational decision of basically in the case of that. And this would have been the argument. Even the argument of the lawyer involved on the pro-abortion side on that time with it even recanted her side with it at that time. That should show you where the actual argument stands. Because they feel that that lawyer felt that they were kind of duped into this whole situation. And so that was considered kind of a dark time. That was one of those dark times in the judicial period of what would be considered rational thought. Now, when it comes back down to the idea of legislating on rational thought, we're talking basically is we need to still apply those two documents. Those are the two documents that should be first and foremost, even before you think of the constituents in your area. Those are the two documents that are above the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are the two documents that you're going to think of when you're making your actual decisions. And that's very, very key to when you act in your rational decisions. And you're going to be using these specifically. And anything that goes against these specifically is going to be a violation. And we're going to be actually looking at actually the meanings behind all of these specifically when a congressperson would when they're looking at how we actually interpret these. And you look at the original meaning of all these things and you understand that basically is when it comes down to it is they meant for the people, such as the people to be armed equally to what the military had, and it was for individuals. That's what the militia referred to, and such things as like when like with war, we weren't meant to be the founders did not meant us to be in entangling alliances, basically, where you weren't meant to be allied with other nations. Such things as NATO was not meant to be in existence. We weren't meant to be in things such as the United Nations. We weren't meant to have anything such as the United Nations on our actual shores. We weren't meant to actually be allied with other nations, such as having allies to begin with. We are just meant to have diplomatic relations with other nations in general. This meant that we were not to have any type of agreements of defending any nations whatsoever in any type of oral or written agreements. The only nation we were to defend were the United States and the United States territories. That was it. And this is something that's it would be under what is constitutional, and those are things that need to be understood, because this is what would be on the duties and what would be considered rational to the actual what would be rational for the actual decision making. Now, when we look at other rational points, is we need to look at you need to go and look at terrorism from the actual idea of what you can actually look at from terrorist attacks in the past with it. And if you I know it's not academic source, but Wikipedia does have a list of a graph from the what it called that shows the terrorism's from which shows the number of incidents, injuries, and deaths from 1970 to current, and what it does is is if you're familiar with it, you should see an actual thing that's very, very consistent with the level of intervention. It almost follows with the level of intervention and the level of and also the level of attacks. The more intervention we had meant that the more attacks that were going to occur, and that's something that's actually that should be noted, and it follows directly within that point, and that's something that people need to understand. And this would be using a rational thought of saying that, hey, if there's more attacks that are happening from this from more overseas intervention to begin with, shouldn't we end the actual idea of the war on terror? Because if they're fighting, if by us fighting them over there, that's causing more attacks and more terrorism attacks, shouldn't it be more reasonable to think that if we reduce our number of interventions, that's what the outcome will be is we'll actually have less numbers of terror attacks, and this would be a rational decision. Now, when we look at the actual thing of when is people state that they can't relinquish the ideas of the NSA spying and other things like that because they say the terrorism. Well, the fact is now we go back to the to rational decisions of rational thinking and not just thinking on feelings, because a lot of people go on this feeling thing. Now, this is another point. When did where do we have documented terrorist attacks back to? What era? Well, it goes back to 1 AD. This is well before the foundation of the country. The actual name of terrorism goes back to 1784. If you look back at the U.S. Constitution, you'll actually see the you'll go back and you will see on the way each you'll see the way each one of these things is would be you'll see at what years it would be ratified or actually written. And we see that basically is it was actually proposed actually on 1789. Now, this would have been, and then it was ratified in 1790 on 1791. So, if it were proposed in 1789 and ratified in 1791, guess what? These ones that were done in 17 the ones that were ratified in 1791, that means that they were actually 7 years after the actual distinguishment of the term terrorism. This is actually the distinguishment of the actual term. So for those stating that, oh, terrorism didn't exist when they actually had the Fourth Amendment. Well, it actually did. It actually existed for 7 years. So for the Fourth Amendment, yeah, it did, and you can't say, oh, it was a different time back then when they established it. It actually had already existed. So the actual term had actually already existed, and if you look back actually in the Constitution itself, they had already had issues with ships of with the reason why they established the Navy was to deal with piracy and other already which was from things like that, from actual attacks on the United States from that factor. So they were already dealing with problems with that. There was already an establishment of a caliphate during that period that was already a problem. So Islamic Sunni Islamic terrorism would have already been an issue during that period. So when they're talking about terrorism being an issue, guess what? It was already going to be established by that point, and that's so. When we're talking about the Fourth Amendment, when they try to make those things, they're basically just talking out of emotion and about feelings, and not about governing on rational decisions. They're not actually making a rational decision. They're basically just going off emotion and trying to appeal to the emotions of people to do this, instead of going off the actual rational decisions of actual fact. The facts are that there are no legitimate reason that we should disobey the Constitution for such a reason. When it comes down to any of this, there's never any legitimate reason. Even when we start looking at the actual facts of have any of these NSA programs actually caught anybody? No, none of them. When we start to look at the what has the NSA program been used for? Well, it's actually been shown through some events that the FBI's illegally used it to bust people in the war on drugs, which and yet covertly cover it up, which is completely violating the actual Constitution, because there's not supposed to be they're not supposed to use that, because they're not supposed to use that for that, because you're supposed to have individual warrants for the way you actually deal with the actual individual domestic cases. That's supposed to be solely based on terrorism. And what they're using it for is they're using it for other basic criminal cases, and they've been found to use it for general criminal cases. And it's shown that the FBI is accessing it for criminal cases. They're even accessing it for just personal reasons. People are accessing these databases for personal reasons, just to spy on people, to spy on loved ones and such. And the fact is this is its only real usage, and it has no actual function. So when we look at this from a reasonable perspective and without feelings on the whole thing, we see this. Now let's look at the idea of war. When we look at war with it, is when we start to go to war, is when we go out there, is are we going to make these countries better or worse by enforcing new governments? Well, the fact is, we need to look at, if they were not going to establish a democracy, specifically a democratic republic, on their own, why do we expect they're going to, after we blow apart their country and attack them, to do so? The fact is they're not going to. The fact, when we start to take out these leaders, they're not going to establish these things. What's the only way these changes happen is voluntarily, and this is basically just a rational thought. And this is why what ends up happening is you usually get more resistance, and they usually become more extreme, and the only thing the war is going to cause is opening up a vacuum for some type of extreme group to come in. In the Middle East, your best case scenario is that Hezbollah is going to jump in and actually secure the area to ensure that a Sunni group does not grab it. Now, Hezbollah is basically, if you look at their charter, they're basically just against imperialism. They're not this terrorist group that that people make them out to be. They're merely just against imperialism, and their whole history is that they've fought against Sunni groups that are basically trying to attack without provocation against Shia groups. This is the same thing when we look at what Israel's attacked Shia groups without provocation. And basically what they're known for is basically kind of withstanding these provocations and not giving up. So they've developed a bad name for their tenacity. And what we see is this is why what ends up happening in Capitol Hill is, instead of looking at things rationally, which would mean that basically we say, okay, this is a group that basically has gone through and kind of somewhat corrected our mistakes and tried to essentially piece together what we've kind of made massive errors with. We've gone through, we have people basically going on feelings and going on what they've gotten from propaganda news areas with it, because you got to understand, when we look at Israel really is when we look at the actual function, Israel never accepted capitalism from when Milton Friedman tried to go down there and try to convince them. They never accepted that. They only accepted it for a couple of years and then rejected it. They basically get their funding from Western governments, but socially and economically and militarily, they are a socialist government. So what they do is they actually pretty much, the government itself is pretty much controlling the way that journalism is working. So their journalism is pretty much a PR firm for their country, which means that any journalism that comes out there is going to be very, very similar to journalism that comes out of, like, China. So you should be very, very suspect of any journalism that comes out of Israel. It's going to basically be propaganda. And while you might find one good piece with it every rare type of time, 99.99 repeating percent of it is going to be garbage and propaganda. And this is what needs to be understood. So that's we need to understand is, when they're blasting about Hezbollah is basically nothing has done. If you look at their history and look a little bit deeper of what they've done and look at their actual actions, we should see rationally what they've done, and they've kind of only piece together. You look at what they've done. Have they actually attacked anybody unprovoked? The fact is, no. You might go, oh, but what about the war between in Lebanon between them and Israel? Well, that was what it called. Israel attacked Lebanon unprovoked. That was the whole point. Well, when what ended up happening was Hezbollah outlasted them, and Israel basically ran with their tail between their legs, and that was how it ended. Because they got outlasted, and Israel knew there was no shot of winning the war, and because there was no shot of winning, Israel did not want to have to essentially deplete their military force to end up trying to win. So they knew the best they could, and they did not want to try out for a stalemate, and a stalemate meant, and the only type of stalemate that there would be was is Israel would end up doing would be that Israel would essentially would have to suffer essentially the loss. And this is where we get the idea of actually thinking rationally. So we need to view these things rationally, not just assuming actually what is actually given to us. Assume where these actual sources are coming from, not just assume these sources essentially are legit. When you start to do that, you'll actually view things as being a little bit more clear. And that's what a lot of these people in the legislative bodies are not doing. They're assuming that Israel is this upstanding ally, and that they have done that. And this is where we get to another rational thing. They go on emotion, and they say Israel should be an ally. Well, when we view relationships between countries, what really has Israel done that's actually positive? And and they basically, nobody can answer that question. They'll try to say, oh, but we share intelligence. Well, you can share intelligence with any other country. Russia's shared intelligence with us. They actually shared intelligence and told us about the 9/11 attacks well in advance, and we ignored them. Okay. So they share intelligence. Are we allies with them? Well, no. We actually, what it called, for some reason, we consider them some type of foe. And we're still perpetuating this falsehood that they tried to intervene in our elections, when we have clear evidence that they didn't. That they didn't do any more influence on the elections than any other country around the globe, and actually much less than most other countries did around the globe. And that the United States does much more influencing on elections globally than like every other country combined. So when we're looking at that, we need to look rationally on that. So it's so that statement doesn't fit. So people go, oh, they do economic trade. Well, so do a bunch of other countries, and that you don't have to have an allyship with a country when we're talking about actually doing diplomatic things such as trade. You don't need to be allied with a country. We've done trade with Iran before without being allied, and that is an actual fact. We used to get pistachio nuts from Iran without being allied with them before all these stupid sanctions were put through. Now we go to the next part. They'll state, usually people tend to launch onto the thing of, oh, but the Holocaust and World War II. Well, that goes back to, number one, that goes back to feelings. Number two is I can dispute that because we can start disputing about the about when Israel was established. Israel was established during the Treaty of Versailles, so that is a complete irrational argument. And they'll go, oh, but anti-Semitism. Well, that's another point of when we're talking about feelings, and that's completely irrational. And they'll say but we need to be allied with Jews in the region because Jews and Christians need to get along. Well, that's another thing based on feelings. And this is a thing where we need to view things rationally. Is what is our actual legitimate reason to be allied with them? And once we start breaking it down, it shows there's no legitimate reason. Just like there's no legitimate reason for us to be allied with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, when we look at it, we produce number one, we produce our own energy. What else do they trade? Nothing. They don't trade us anything else. We produce our own energy. They're not buying as much, they're stating that they're not buying as much treasuries as they used to from us. They've basically, when it comes down to it, is they're essentially just basically taking weapons from us and basically dragging us into war as much as Israel is. So essentially they're wasting a lot of our money and basically having us essentially pay for their defense. And basically, essentially, they're the number one exporter of terrorism, which is basically making our situation much worse. So pretty much by us doing this, and they're essentially handing their weapons deliberately over to Al Qaeda, as we've seen over in the Yemen crisis. And we from everything, even after we asked them specifically that within an agreement that they could not, that they would be refueled only at the case of that they did not aid any terrorist groups, and they've already violated that. Now when we see this, is that's another allyship that basically makes 0 sense. And when we start to see this, we see that basically there is no allies in the Middle East that actually make any sense. Now, our reason for being in the Middle East? No reason. And when we start to look at, and because we get no actual kickback from that, there's no legitimate reason. They go, oh, but we get bases there. Okay. Are the bases safe? Well, no, because there's a lot of terrorism in the region that Saudi Arabia is supplying. Well, that means that there's no legitimate reason for those bases to be there. And they go, oh, our base is there to fight terrorism. Well, that's counterproductive. Essentially, we could actually send all of our people home if we just essentially disassociate with the region. And it's very easy. They go, oh, but then we'll lose presence over the region. Well, is our presence really needed? Is there what it called? Do we have to make decisions over the region? Could we just basically simply declare that we're going to make decisions over our own country? Do we have to basically influence the whole globe? Can we essentially just make the decision that we're only going to make decisions over our own nation and treat sovereignty with respect? Because if we declare that we don't want another country trying to influence ourselves, could we not make the same decision that we don't want our own country influencing others? And that's where we get to rational thinking. And I think that this is another point to where we get to some of these congressmen not thinking rational either, because they'll accuse Russia of unproven facts but yet not be willing to. But when there is actual facts that show U.S. is trying to influence many other countries around the globe, they're not willing to. And when we admit it, they're not willing to essentially back off. Well, the fact is if we're doing that with it, why do we expect that there should be any difference? And the same thing goes up in Europe with NATO. Why should we even have a presence? Is it even worth it? Because the fact is when we look at NATO, they go, we're finding that they're not putting money into it. Now this should make us think on the rational level. If they're not putting money into NATO, this means that they don't view Russia as the threat that we do. And if they don't view Russia as the threat that we do, is NATO really an actual need that we have for our system? And it should mean that we should not be putting any money into NATO, and we should exit. And that would be the rational decision. But what we're finding with a lot of legislators is they're saying, oh, no, we can't exit NATO at all. And that's the whole point that we're finding, is that we're finding people do that. And and that's what's happening out there. And because of what NATO has done, we've gotten to a point to where it's caused a lot of strain between Russia, where Russia's stating that they might even move weapons actually within our region to actually threaten us, because the fact is we're essentially going to put up a base within their borders with missile capabilities. Well, frankly, is if they do the same with us, with putting something very, very close with missile capabilities, we would be threatened as well. So the fact is the idea to get peace would essentially be to reverse course and get out of NATO and stop these irrational behaviors based on emotion and trying to prove that there was no collusion and all this other garbage when there wasn't to begin with. When it was basically a DNC staffer that actually was giving WikiLeaks the information on the emails, and that's where it was coming from. And this thing is keep blowing out of proportion, where it's basically can cause World War III because of a lost election, which is basically irrational, and that's where it's based on feelings, and this is where feelings basically are completely irrational in decision making. You want to basically be rational in your decision making. This is why we go with the Constitution, the other pieces of writings, the historical writings before the Declaration of Independence, and actually looking at things in a rational manner. We don't go with feelings. Feelings don't matter when actually making these decisions. When you do that, you should basically be stepping aside, because you have no business in this whole arena. Those people who are saying, who are basically trying to make these decisions and saying, oh, but we need this, we need that, we need this, we need that, and oh, but he said this, and all these other petty garbage things with it, and oh, but the poor people, oh, but all this other garbage. No, we need rational decision making. This is why we have a lot of problems out there, is because people have added a lot of spending, a lot of this other garbage to the government, and we get allied with countries. We have all this other stuff with it that have basically changed around our original foreign policy. Our original foreign policy, we had no allies, zero. We were basically aligned where we had interactions with other countries diplomatically, but we had no allyships. We weren't allied with one country. What about Britain? No, we just split with Britain at that time. We weren't allied with them. We had no relations except diplomatically with them. And there was no relations at all. And then when we look at the rest of the world, it was just diplomatic. We weren't in any entangling alliances. We weren't in any wars except defending ourselves. And that was the only thing that it meant. And that was and the reason why we declared why war is meant to be declared in Congress itself was for that purpose. Was so we didn't go to these stupid wars to begin with. And when we started getting into the progressive era, they started changing the term of common defense, where common defense was only meant to mean the states of the United States. They started using common defense and changing that purpose to meaning some bit of this world, and where we were meant to be these world policemen. And that was changing the idea of this non-intervention foreign policy to start meaning this liberal foreign policy perspective that was embraced by both the neoconservatives and these progressives and liberals and socialists and communists in the country. And that we still see to this day. If you want to actually get to the original foreign policy, it was not an intervention. And it was basically judging countries by their actual ideas, and it was what would be considered, by the perspectives, it would be considered the identity perspective, and that's the only legitimate perspective out there. Even the realist perspective would not be considered to be close, because it views as any change in the actual perspective as it views it as a potential problem for the government, as a potential anarchy for the system. So if one government changes a leader, they could potentially, just in a normal election, that could be just considered as anarchy. And even if it's just in a normal election, regardless if it's a fair election or not. And that's something that a realist perspective could do, even if there's far enough differences between the leaders. And that's a very big problem. And that's where we find, that's why we go with that perspective. Now, when we look at the other points of the founders, is they were not, there was reasons why they did not believe in giving out all of this aid, because they understood that when a government gets big, it gets tyrannical. And they wanted it as small as possible, because the fact is if they can decide to, a government that can decide to give you something can decide to take something else away from someone else, or even you. And they wanted basically it be so small that basically it had no impact on your life. And that they wanted basically it to make very, very minimal decisions. and that was its whole point. And its only decisions it wanted to make were very, very small. And it's the only type of big decision it wanted to make was basically when it was very, very drastic, when it was a very, very drastic moment, such as going to war, and that was its only case. Beyond that, it was meant to be very, very small moments because, oh shoot, but beyond that, it was meant to be very, very small moments because it wasn't meant to be these huge moments of like trying to vote for these huge amounts of spending, and we weren't supposed to have recurring spending. It was okay for spending to expire, and that's the whole thing. And that would be a rational decision to make. Let spending expire. Because when you do that, it's this is when we why we have the 60 vote threshold, is because if spending expires, it basically means that you can essentially do such as a 2-week span, and you would have a very, very simple thing where you have the 12 different bills that need to be brought forth, the 12 spending bills. Now, in each of those bills with it, you could essentially go over 2 bills a day, and do this for 6 days. In the first week, do 2 bills a day, and go over and essentially do an up or down vote for each section in the spending bills of what was currently in them. And what would be is you would say an up or down vote of if you supported keeping it in for spending, if you felt it was okay. Now, if it didn't reach 60 if it didn't reach the passing, then it would be eliminated. Now, the fact is, with this would mean that it would put people on the actual it would put people actually on the record for supporting things such as shrimp on a treadmill, or some of the promiscuous quail on cocaine. It would put them on the record for some of these projects like that, and it would put people on the record for that, where they'd have to vote either yay or nay on those, including in the House and the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And this is why we actually should be advocating for the rational decision of letting spending expire. And this is actually a very, very rational way of governing. To govern by continually letting the stuff go through and saying that to repeal you need to let the stuff repeal you need 60 votes is irrational, because you're just going to continue horrible spending, and any controversial spending would continue, and that's an irrational way to spend, and it's not going to be a smart way to spend. Now, the smart way to spend is actually to eliminate these things through by essentially saying we're going to remove 100% of the spending, and say if we want any of it to start back up, we need the 60 vote threshold from the Senate. Now, it can pass with bare majority in the House, but when it comes to the Senate, we need that 60 vote threshold. And what would happen is what this would do is it would end up is they could probably do it concurrently and make it very, very quick. And essentially they could probably do it within a week anyway, if they were actually really working really hard, or probably take maybe a couple of weeks because of all the time of the first week, and within the second week they could probably just do yay or nay votes, because they've already gotten all the support of it. It should be a near 100. It should be a near 100% vote on the everything else, because you've eliminated all of the extraneous type of extreme votes that could not garner a 60 vote threshold. So everything will automatically pass. And then you'll see a budget that's much smaller. You'll see a budget that's going to be tiny. Now, the fact is the president's going to have to sign it, because essentially, unless he wants to shut down the government for something that's basically getting rid of all the controversial spending. Now it's going to trim out all the departments, the defense, and all these other things that are deemed controversial. But what it's going to do is it's going to trim out a lot of garbage. And you're going to see, and this is how an actual thing should be running. Now, the president could pretty much rubber stamp it without any problems, and you're going to find out that the government's going to be government could easily pay off the debt after this point, because you'll notice that pretty much most of that budget is going to be trimmed out, because there's a lot of controversial spending that ends up going into it. And that defense budget is going to be really shrunk down, because there's going to be a lot of wasted money. And they're going to state, and there's going to be people that are going to oppose a lot of that spending. And eventually, you're going to go year by year, and a lot of that spending eventually is going to go away. And eventually, you're going to get to the point to where we're going to have no foreign aid, no public aid, and we're going to get to the point where it's going to be a bare bones government, and that'll be a rational based government, and it'll be very, very constitutional, it'll be regardless of who's in office, and it'll be basically you'll end up getting that very, very low tax rate that will probably eventually get to a consumption based tax because of it. There will basically be for at every level of purchase, so people will not have to file income tax at all. And people won't have to deal with that stress at all at that point in the year. And they can just eliminate those departments. The Department of Finance and the Department of and the Internal Revenue Service could essentially be eliminated. Those employees could immediately be fired. And that would be the rational decision to do as well. I mean, these people have no business being there, so they'd be considered just strenuous on the government. And as we see, we're not going by feelings, we're going by what is rational. Now, if you keep doing this from department to department, you're going to realize that most of these departments are not rational to keep. You're going to eventually get to the point where you start eliminating nearly all of it. You're going to see that we do not need civilian intelligence either, because military intelligence follows the Constitution. You're going to see that that's the only one to keep. And eventually you're going to get to the point of that's the only one to have left. And you're going to have that point being that that's all you need to keep. So you're going to fire everyone else. And you're going to say, when it comes down to the people who have these security clearances, is security clearance ends once you leave. That would be a rational decision. Because the fact is you're talking about the idea of being the most secure, and it's not saying to actually continue it through, and that's how things would end. And eventually you would this would be the rational decision to do, because you're not going on feelings anymore. Because once the idea of feelings ends in this system, you're going to actually notice the government's going to serve the people a great deal better, because feelings are meant for a complete different utter different area with it, and they have no business in actually governing the people. Feelings, basically, they make things a whole lot worse. And this is why we're in the mess that we are today, because people are actually going on feelings and not rational decisions. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all the way on social media, and share it with friends and everyone else publicly. Make sure they subscribe, and I will see you guys later for my posts on the Second Amendment. You'll probably be surprised with that one as well, because it might be a little bit more extreme than the normal Second Amendment advocates, and make sure you wait for that one, and I'll do my nightly stream as well. Bye, everyone.